Hi, I'm Tone Lanzillo, and as part of the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice, which is being hosted and sponsored by Bard College's graduate programs of sustainability, we'd like to invite you to our climate justice series or Zoom talks, where we've invited 4 authors to share their writings and work with us. And today I'm honored to have with us Brian Tokar. He is the author of Toward Climate Justice, Perspectives on the Climate Crisis and Social Change. Thank you. He's also written The Green Alternative, Earth for Sale, and his latest book is entitled Climate Justice and Community Renewal, Resistance and Grassroots Solutions. He's also a lecturer in the environmental program at the University of Vermont and a longtime faculty member and board member of the Institute for Social Ecology. Welcome, Brian. Great to have you with us today.
It's great to be here and look forward to getting some comments from folks who will be watching this after the live presentation today. I'm going to just start with a, excuse me, just a quick overview, talk a little bit more specifically about some of the contributors to my book, Climate Justice and Community Renewal, and what they contribute to the whole discussion of climate justice, and we can just have some general conversations. I've been involved in environmental issues as both an activist, an educator, and an author for many decades, and really got involved in the ground floor of discussions of what is now fairly widely known as the outlook of climate justice. And I'll say more about what that is once I get started on my slides. But back in the mid-aughts of this century, indigenous activists and representatives of land-based communities from different parts of the world were starting to tell us that beyond what was then very science-centered, which is important but not enough, discussions of climate change, and really only a very minimal level of public activism, that we need to start looking at the justice dimension, the social justice dimensions of the climate crisis, because the people who contribute the least to the problem of excess emissions of carbon dioxide and all the other greenhouse gases are overwhelmingly the people who are most affected and the people who have been most affected now for many decades, as we'll see. So a group I was connected with at the time called the Global Justice Ecology Project, which is still around, and a number of other groups came together to try to be allies to those folks from the front lines who were beginning to articulate a climate justice perspective. And it took quite a while for it to catch on. Fast forward to maybe a decade later, the mid-teens, around the People's Climate March and Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, and developments at the UN level, the discussion of climate justice really began to catch on. My book, Toward Climate Justice, was really one of the first to, I think, lay out a perspective on climate justice for a fairly broad audience. And now, almost 20 years later, climate justice is very much at the center of discussions of the climate crisis around the world. It's mentioned very explicitly in the latest synthesis report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out just a couple of weeks ago. And people really understand what this is about at a much deeper level than any of us even imagined 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm going to just start with some slides and go through them fairly quickly so we have some time for discussion afterwards. So I'm going to share my screen and pick that one. And I assume my slides are now visible. I'm going to turn off the sidebar so we can just focus on the main images, and I trust everyone can see that. And starting here with just an image of the trend in climate emissions, going back to when scientists first started closely monitoring trends in atmospheric carbon dioxide at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, among other places. And for me, excuse me, this graph has a number of take-home messages. Probably most important is that most of the emissions that we've seen have happened during the period of time when scientists were aware of the problem of global climate disruptions, where the media was starting to be aware. Older folks in the audience might remember that James Hansen, one of the most prominent climate scientists in the US, testified before Congress way back in 1988, at a time when the impacts of global climate disruptions were just beginning to be felt in a tangible way. And most of the emissions have occurred during the period when there have been active negotiations around climate policy at the UN level. We see the first World Climate Conference back in '79. We know that back then, companies like Exxon Oil were doing leading edge research on climate issues, but that within a decade, they began an active effort to suppress that research. The first UN conference that really began to develop global policies around climate was in the early 90s. The first climate policies came into effect in the late 90s. And we see through all of these stages that the situation, unfortunately, has continued to just get worse. And we know increasingly well the consequences of this. Here in the US, we're very aware of the wildfires in California and throughout the West, unprecedented heat waves, even in the Pacific Northwest, where summers are typically cool, just a couple of years ago. But we're less aware of how these problems global south to a much more severe degree. And this graphic from The Guardian, I think, reflects that pretty well. Similarly, the hail flooding we've read here in the US about huge floods in the Midwest, unprecedented patterns of hurricanes around the Gulf Coast and other things. But again, so how this is impacting people around the world. There was a massive floods in South Asia just a few years ago, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, we see here in this chart. And terms like polar vortex and atmospheric rivers and all these phenomena that used to be incredibly rare everywhere in the world are now becoming terms that we see discussed in the news every day. Nobody in the world is currently immune from some of the very extreme impacts of the climate crisis, but people in the most vulnerable regions, people who are least responsible for the excess emissions of CO2 and all the other greenhouse gases, are overwhelmingly experiencing the worst effects. That's illustrated by this map from a study from McGill University, which is now 10 years old. And there's been more and more active research on these issues, comparing where most of the emissions come from with where in the world people are most vulnerable. And for the most part, those who contribute the least not just will be, but have already been now for several decades, the most impacted. If you look closely, you'll see the one period of overlap that's red in both maps, of course, is Saudi Arabia, which is a highly vulnerable, in a highly vulnerable region of the world, but also at the same time, the world's largest oil producer. This is a map that just showed up in the latest round of IPCC reports. This is one that came out in the summer of 2021, looking at satellite data over many decades and confirming what we've been hearing from activists in the global south for a long time, which is that they have been experiencing these impacts for many decades. In some places, the Caribbean and Eastern Brazil, parts of East Africa and Southeast Asia, significant changes in temperature and significant increased incidence of all kinds of extreme weather events going back even before the 1980s, whereas in much of the US and Europe, these are still relatively recent phenomena. Also, and just two more data slides, and then we'll go on to just pictures. Also, huge discrepancies in who's responsible for emissions. This is a study from Oxfam from a couple of years ago, showing that according to their calculations, the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for more than half of cumulative emissions, whereas the poorest half of the world is responsible for only about 7%. The IPCC in their latest synthesis report had some similar numbers, a little bit more moderate in its estimates of the economic breakdown of emissions, but the qualitative trend of the wealthiest people, the highest consuming people being overwhelmingly responsible for the problem still rings true. And finally, in terms of data, I'll draw attention to this graph, which hasn't gotten much attention, from a project called the Carbon Majors Database, that actually looks at the specific companies responsible for, in this case, 52% of industrial emissions since the Industrial Revolution, are attributable to only about 100 companies, most of which currently exist. There are a handful that existed in the early 20th century that aren't around anymore. They're overwhelmingly the major fossil fuel companies, both privately owned and state-owned in places like Saudi Arabia and Russia and China, as well as Mexico. And one of the things that's important about this graph, and I'm happy to send the link to anybody who's interested, is that it looks not just at emissions from internal operations, when companies like Shell Oil and BP claim that they're going to be carbon neutral. They really are mostly talking only about their internal operations, as opposed to taking into account emissions from the products they're selling. And this graph, unlike most, also looks at the emissions from the products that these various companies are selling. And the overwhelmingly largest bar on the far left is Saudi Aramco, the national oil company of Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to show you some pictures based on the chapters in my latest book, co-edited with my colleague Tamara Gilbertson, and it's titled Climate Justice and Community Renewal, Resistance and Grassroots Solutions. It was published by Routledge in the UK in 2020. There are some discounts available, and I hope folks will check it out, and most importantly, get your libraries to order it. The need that sparked the development of this book was the lack of real firsthand accounts from people in those parts of the world who are consistently most affected by climate disruptions. And we decided that we would not only include accounts of people fighting extraction of fossil fuels and other resources in their homelands, but also people paving the way, making a path toward genuinely community-centered solutions to the climate crisis. In the area of social ecology, which I've been identified with for many decades, we've talked for a long time about the need for challenging the status quo and simultaneously creating living alternatives, showing that other ways of life, other ways of meeting our basic needs are not only possible, but can be implemented right now. The alternatives already exist, we know that. And the synthesis of the oppositional and alternative oriented currents, the oppositional and reconstructive currents have been crucial to the perspective of climate justice from the beginning. So this book brings together original accounts from people on 5 continents. It highlights popular responses to a variety of false climate solutions, as we'll see, some of the limits of current climate diplomacy, and again, the wide scope of reconstructive projects informed by a climate justice perspective. So I'll just show you some photos of some of the people and projects and efforts that are profiled in this book. We start in the forests of far northeastern Quebec and Labrador, where indigenous Innu people, also Cree people, have been fighting massive scale hydroelectric dams. Hydroelectric power is nominally renewable, and certainly hydropower will continue to be part of a sustainable energy future. But beyond a certain scale, the destructive potential of hydropower becomes very clear. And there's a provincially owned company called Hydro-Quebec that's been damming up huge river systems in Quebec all the way out to Labrador and Newfoundland for many decades now, at the expense of the land, at the expense of the livelihood and way of life of indigenous people like these folks. And here's an example of the scale of destruction that we're seeing in the name of mega-scale hydro, which I very much put in the category of false solutions to the climate crisis. We have accounts of people in South America fighting both petroleum extraction and also the replacement of some of their native forests, some of their tropical rainforests, with plantations of commercial trees, most often grown for timber, but also sometimes grown as biofuel feedstocks. And biofuels are another supposed solution that's often put forward, sometimes by agribusiness and even fossil fuel interests, that in some applications on, say, an individual farm scale, biofuels can be very beneficial, but on a large scale tend to be in the category of false solutions. So here we have people in an indigenous community in Ecuador protesting petroleum extraction on their land. One of the communities profiled in the book is this community in northeastern Brazil, where people have been meeting in gatherings like this to discuss how to protect their forest from both the petroleum industry and the problem of replacement of forests by commercial timber plantations. Another one of the false solutions discussed in the book that's being fought by people in indigenous communities in Latin America and elsewhere is the idea of using forests as sources of carbon offsets. So oil companies in the US can take credit for nominally saving forests and use it to claim that they're doing their part to reduce emissions, even as their production of oil increases. And often this involves the displacement of people who've been living sustainably in those forests for generations. So we have communities like this one opposing, in this case, a UN program known as REDD, R-E-D-D, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation of Forests. But it's very much in the category of false solutions. And there have been exposés by journalists from groups like ProPublica that have gone into tremendous detail about how people and land are being exploited by this particular false solution. And in the book, we have an account from an activist from the World Rainforest Movement who's been working on the ground with many of these communities for a long time. This is a gathering of forest-dwelling people in India who similarly have been fighting to protect their forests in the ways that they and their ancestors have learned how to do over countless generations. And the integrity of the land, the ability to protect the climate in ways that are genuinely sustainable for the long run depends on the integrity of the lives of the people who depend on that land. And we read in this chapter in the book about the Forest Rights Act from almost a couple of decades now, that was the Indian government's response to the protests of forest-dwelling people, and but has in many ways been co-opted and been sabotaged by governments increasingly allied with extractive industries. And quote from the chapter by Sumitra Ghosh, who's a brilliant independent researcher and activist in India, who says the movements asserted people's sovereignty over forests and pronounced opposition to state control. First, by moving away from statist interpretations of those laws, which were nominally supposed to empower forest peoples, and secondly, by posing the institution of the village assembly, the Gram Sabha, as the supreme governing authority in forest and tribal areas. He says, by defending as well as creating non-state and anti-capitalist struggle spaces, the new movements in Indian forests mark an evident and visible rupture in the status quo. Whether this rupture will deepen and coalesce in a different and more equitable social order, of course, remains to be seen. These are ongoing struggles of people trying to maintain their land and livelihood in the face of both extractive industry and the use of forests by those same industries as a way to claim that they're able to continue polluting by taking steps to nominally protect the forests, even though it's, again, often at the expense of the people who know the land the best. This is a group called the Pacific Climate Warriors, people from the Marshall Islands and other Pacific Island nations. This demonstration was in downtown San Francisco, but these folks have been doing things like blocking ports in Australia that are still being used at an accelerating pace for the extraction and export of coal, and bringing both their cultural forms, their cultural displays, and their political message to cities around the world, with the overwhelming message that even though sea levels are rising and their communities are sometimes being displaced, their overwhelming message, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And there's a lot of literature about the Pacific Climate Warriors, in addition to the chapter in the book that describes their actions in a lot more detail. We have a chapter from Scott Parkin, who's part of an international network called Rising Tide that really advanced the use of direct action methods in the climate movement, going back to the early teens when there really wasn't yet much of a direct action oriented climate movement. This is the tar sands blockade in Texas and Oklahoma, where environmental activists came together with local landowners to try to block the construction of the southern leg of the Keystone XL oil pipeline that supposed to pipe oil from the Canadian tar sands, the most destructive single industrial project on earth, to the ports on the Gulf Coast. And even though the Obama administration, and then affirmed recently by Biden, have blocked the construction of most of the Keystone pipeline, the part that goes from the oil terminals of Oklahoma down to the Gulf Coast was actually built and approved and opened during the Obama administration. And these folks did what they could to, excuse me, to hold up that process. They weren't immediately successful, but I would argue that this campaign was one of the crucial steps toward making people aware of the kinds of on-the-ground engaged direct action that's necessary to hold back the worst excesses of the climate crisis. And that wave of climate activism in the teens, I would argue, really culminated in the massive mobilization of both indigenous nations and non-indigenous supporters at Standing Rock in North Dakota in 2016, where people gathered to block the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. We know that the approval of the pipeline was one of the Trump administration's very first acts when Trump became president in 2017. But this movement in North Dakota really galvanized people from all across the continent and really around the world. And people who became involved around Standing Rock got involved in efforts to stop their own regional pipeline projects. And many of those action campaigns in the aftermath of Standing Rock were very successful in places like Louisiana and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and other parts of the country. Then the story shifts to South Africa, where we have incredible disparities of wealth and social standing. We have a wealthy elite that has some of the highest rates of fossil fuel consumption in the world. And we have people in rural communities at the receiving end of continued exploitation of oil and also coal. And people are up against a lot, but they're starting to stand up to address and confront the institutions responsible for these problems. The transition in the book between the first half that focuses mainly on climate impacts and opposition to extraction of various kinds, the transition toward the community renewal part of the book is a chapter based in Puerto Rico. And folks may remember that a few years ago, the whole Caribbean basin was devastated by a massive, unprecedented series of hurricanes, of huge tropical storms. We read mostly about its effects in places like the city of Houston in the US, but entire Caribbean islands were completely devastated. And in Puerto Rico, where the impacts were pretty severe, one of the things that we learned is that those farms that were engaged in the practices of agroecology, which draws together long known indigenous wisdom about sustainable ways to grow food, validated and enhanced by the scientific study and further development of those very traditional indigenous methods. The farms engaged in agroecology were really at the leading edge of the recovery from Hurricane Maria and other storms in Puerto Rico. And two agroecologists from Puerto Rico, one of whom is also a social ecologist and whom I've known for a couple of decades, have really a terrific chapter where they tell the story of how people engage and people in communities engaged in practices of agroecology really led the recovery. So this is the transition for the community renewal part of the book. Then we go to Bolivia, where 20 years ago, when this photo was taken, there was a huge uprising in the city of Cochabamba against the privatization of their water supply, which was successful. And now, 20 years later, communities are engaged in building their own local water catchment systems where they're trapping rainwater, doing it on a community basis, and relieving some of the systemic problems with their water infrastructure that drove the process toward privatization and corporatization 20 years ago. And these kinds of community water catchment systems are popping up in the vicinity of Cochabamba in Bolivia, as well as other parts of the country and other places in South America as well. Then we come to the US. This is Detroit, and you can see some of the downtown buildings in the background. Detroit, of course, was the center of the auto industry for most of the 20th century. But by the latter decades of the 20th century, the auto industry was becoming increasingly automated. Plants were moving to the south and overseas, and the city of Detroit was devastated initially. It lost something like 2/3 of its population over a period of about 20 years, and there came to be large amounts of vacant land that people then took over and began planting gardens, developing community art projects, doing all kinds of community-centered experiments to show that it's possible for people in even some of the poorest areas in Detroit to live sustainably on the land, to grow a lot of their own food, and to break out of the cycle of dependence on the corporate industrial economy that Detroit was completely trapped in for so many decades. One of the consequences of depopulation was entire city blocks became vacant. The houses, in some cases, eventually fell apart. Whole blocks looked abandoned, and people came in and started creating new infrastructure, including these wonderful gardens. This is a tour I was part of during a conference in 2019, again, looking at a garden on the site of an abandoned industrial facility in Detroit. And also a fight for water. We know about the extreme water crises in places like Flint, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi. There's also been a water crisis and a threat of privatization and people losing their access to safe drinking water right in Detroit. A theme of a couple of the later chapters of the book is the issue of and the need for a just transition, the idea of a just transition away from dependence on polluting industry is an idea that was really first developed by coming together of people from the labor movement and people from the environmental justice movement, fighting toxic pollution back in the 1980s and 90s. And this idea of the need for a just transition is very much in the forefront of climate justice discussions. And we know that people whose livelihood has become dependent on polluting industries like oil extraction and oil refining need to have a place in our fossil-free future. The book features an indigenous perspective on just transition, which I think looks at the problem much more holistically than just the focus on jobs, as important as that is. And we also have a feminist perspective on just transition that looks at the question of what about people engaged in the care economy and how a transition away from extraction can potentially enhance the care economy, which historically has been a set of jobs dominated by women, but we know right now the scope of that, the scope and the need for a more caring economy is felt throughout the population in all sectors of our communities. From there, we go to Europe, where cities have been actively engaged in greening themselves for a number of decades. Karl Ludwig Scheibel, who for many years was the head of the European Green Cities Network, has a chapter where he talks about things like bicycle transportation here in near the center of Amsterdam, which has been moving where, like many Northern European cities especially, have been systematically moving away from car dependence. Here we have community gardens right in the edge of a major railway corridor in the suburbs of Paris. And then we end with profiles of a number of projects around New York State that embody the principle of energy democracy, which is moving toward not just renewable energy, but community-controlled renewable energy. This is a project in Harlem, where they've installed solar panels on the roofs of public housing. So people who are benefiting from these projects have a say in how they're developed and how they continue to be managed. And this group called We Act, which has been fighting pollution in West Harlem for, again, many decades, has also developed a program to train neighborhood youth in Harlem to be the installers of these solar panels. So bringing democracy into the energy sphere in a much more explicit way. And there are a couple of other projects in other parts of the state profiled in that chapter as well. So that's a quick overview of some of the stories and some of the people described in our book, Climate Justice and Community Renewal. Maybe I'll skip this slide or just discuss it very quickly, which is a whole discussion into itself of how our actions at the local and particularly the municipal level can really point toward a strategy for addressing global scale problems like worldwide climate disruptions. And we know that there are many locally based initiatives around climate, the ones highlighted in the book and others. We know about the Fearless Cities movement, founded in Barcelona, but spread around the world, focusing on the democratization of cities and wide scope of actions to halt new fossil fuel infrastructure. We know that for about 10 years, there's been a trend in Europe and even somewhat in the US toward the remunicipalization of public services that had been privatized during the height of the neoliberal era in the 1980s and 90s, and now we're getting back toward local public control. We know that there are efforts in cities all across the country that are helping catalyze broader policy changes, whether it's the campaign for better minimum wages, which began with an ordinance in Seattle and has spread across the country, efforts to provide sanctuary for threatened immigrant communities, and many other efforts that begin at the local level and expand outward. We also know that many of the environmental laws that we take for granted in the US weren't gifts from on high. They were the result of massive mobilizations against pollution across the country in the 1960s, where cities and states were beginning to pass laws against pollution. Major polluters were being sued, and there emerged a consensus even among a lot of elite circles that they'd rather live under a regime of uniform national regulations of pollution than have to be subjected to increasingly stringent requirements that were being imposed locally. And maybe that's a model for how we can get through the current deadlock around climate policy here in the US. And many movements for municipal power, various confederal project efforts emerging to bring together all kinds of alternative-minded efforts around the country and around the world. And again, that's the cover of the book. And I will end it there. And hi to those of you who joined during the slides.
A question I always love to ask, where did your interest in the environment and climate change begin?
Well, I mean, it began at a pretty early age. I was a teenager during the beginnings of the environmental movement. I was a little too young in 1970 to participate in the first Earth Day, but I read a lot about it and started reading about these issues. Then I went to a university, MIT, where you could only take classes in environmental issues if you were an advanced civil engineering student, which I was not. So I kind of had to put that aside for a few years. But then in the late 1970s, here in New England, we saw the beginnings of a massive regional and eventually national movement against nuclear power. So I became very involved in the anti-nuclear movement, and that was really the beginning of my more focused engagement in environmental issues. And I was in the late 70s, I was in grad school studying biophysics and neurophysiology, and also continuing to be involved in anti-nuclear work. I was starting to spend time here in Vermont with folks involved with social ecology, and eventually decided to step away from the hard science world and do social ecology and other environmental work full time. Started writing about these issues for various newsletters that were around at the time, and ended up being invited to write my first book on green politics around when I was only about 30 years old in the mid-1980s, and it kind of continued to evolve from there.
Wow, thank you. I know in speaking to activists and educators, others who are involved in climate work, it can often be somewhat challenging and frustrating. So I'm always interested in what motivates and inspires people. So for yourself over the years, what can you identify anyone or anything that's kind of motivated or inspired you over the years?
Well, it's really two things. One is the urgency of the situation, which becomes clearer and clearer every year. But a lot of people, as you suggested, deal with the urgency of the situation by tuning it out, by feeling hopeless, that things are hopeless, and there's nothing we can do. So the other side of what's kept me engaged is being inspired by all of the various social and environmental movements that I've been part of, that I've followed over the years, really starting with the anti-nuclear movement, where we had huge demonstrations initially against one proposed nuclear project on the seacoast of New Hampshire, and seeing how that movement spread around the country, so that by the time of the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, it became clear that that whole wave of nuclear power development just had to come to an end. And within a few years, that 1970s wave of nuclear construction was really completely cut short. You know, back in the mid 70s, the US government was saying there would be as many as 1,000 nuclear power plants around the country. And they were starting to do meteorological testing in rural communities all over the country, and people in a lot of those communities combined with activists in the cities came together and said, no way, we can't live with these extreme hazards that we know nuclear power represents. Now, of course, nuclear power is being painted by some as a climate solution, and from where I sit, it's very clear that it's not. The only nuclear projects currently under construction in the US are in Georgia, and they're 10, 15 years, they're taking 10, 15 years longer to build than was projected. And the cost of those projects has multiplied 2, 3, 5-fold. Nuclear power is too expensive. Nuclear power takes too long to build, and it's ultimately far too hazardous. It's not a solution to the climate crisis by any stretch. We know that already today in 2023, in many places around the country and around the world, it's actually cheaper to build new solar and wind installations than it is to maintain existing fossil fuel dependent or nuclear dependent energy infrastructure. And with batteries becoming cheaper and more affordable, and new battery technologies that are less dependent on the extreme levels of mining that current technologies require, which is a serious problem, we really have the potential for a thoroughly transformed energy system, as well as a transformed economic system, which I think we need, because the profit motive is not enough to get us through the transition that we need as quickly as we need it. So we need to look at short-term economic alternatives as articulated by the energy democracy movement, but also thinking about more sweeping social and economic and political transformations that will empower communities to get the energy they need and the other needs of life without depending on this incredibly destructive, extractive, profit-centered system that has gotten us into the mess that we're currently in. So that was a long answer to a short question, knowing that the alternatives exist and knowing that social movements make a difference.
Gotcha. See, we've got a question here.
Yes, thank you, Tony, and thank you for the presentation. And please excuse me for coming late. I'm here in the mountains of Norway, and I know Tony through the World Climate School. And my question is, as you mentioned, you started your kind of care and love for nature and the deeper ecology of the planet and life in your 30s. So knowing myself, starting like a couple of years back, I'm feeling a little bit sad sometimes. Why does it take so long? What is your perspective on that? On how do you kind of keep the stamina up on this important work that you do?
I think you're right. It does take too long. We know from what the IPCC put out just a couple of weeks ago that we don't have much time. They're saying now that greenhouse gas emissions really need to peak in the next 2 or 3 years if we're going to have a chance of not experiencing vastly more severe consequences of the climate disruptions than we're seeing now. That we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. This profit-centered system doesn't like to hear those kinds of projections. What keeps me hopeful are, one, living here where I do in the mountains of Vermont, staying close to the land, looking forward now in mid-April to getting my hands in the dirt pretty soon, starting to prune fruit trees, you know, being part of the cycles that have sustained life for millennia, but also, again, understanding the power of movements to really change things. The challenges are pretty daunting, but we know that despair and resignation will not get us to where we need to be. We
That's
know
true.
that the actions that we take now make a huge difference. There was an important paper by James Hansen's climate group about 10 years ago now that said that the pace at which we reduce emissions now can make the difference between having lingering effects of the current climate crisis last maybe a few hundred years. But if we don't take action now, we're seeing the effects linger on for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, and ultimately proving to be irreversible. So if we want to see life on Earth continue to thrive in the ways that humans have taken for granted for millennia, we really need to act now. The time window is short, and we do need to move faster than we can sometimes imagine. And I think the youth movement is articulating the need for that more clearly than anybody else. Of course, the COVID pandemic interrupted that a little bit. You know, in Europe, there were the Fridays for Future, where kids were leaving school and protesting for climate action every Friday. I think in some countries that has continued. We've seen a few youth-led climate strikes in some areas here in the US. I think the youth movement is a central source of hope, but also those of us who have been around and seen emissions continue to rise during the decades that we've known of the severity of the problem have a responsibility to also do our part.
Thanks, Inga. Yeah, I just, I guess on behalf of Climate Justice, I really appreciate you being with us today, Brian. And for those who are with us right now, just to share with you, and we'll get to the question, is the recordings of all the Zoom talks will be shared with various universities and colleges, as well as climate groups over the next days and weeks. And that does include Bard College, Vanderbilt University, St. Scholastica College, and UCLA. So we will be sharing these talks with other groups over the coming days. And it looks like we have another question.
So I'm an environmental scientist by training, studied mongooses in West Africa a long time ago, saw deforestation, and went into conservation biology and work in the federal government. But recently, as Tone knows, that I have quit my job and started a climate action resource hub called Climate Steps. Mm-hmm. And I don't really have a question, but I do have a comment in that we're kind of work at kind of a finer scale, but overlapping in community efforts. And one of the things that frustrates me a lot is that people assume that individuals don't have power. So what I liked was your statement that, you know, understanding the power that humans have. Sometimes I've got introverts and sometimes I've got extroverts in my groups. Introverts have power too. They can comment on public regulations. They can do things, but of course, social movements and talking to your neighbors and community efforts and actual movements create a ripple effect. So I wanted to let you know that we have a expert, not an expert, he's a owner of the community section in Climate Steps, and he's been gathering research. And some of the examples that you pointed out, I haven't read your book yet, but I think he has. But I really want to help stress on our site, and kind of just through, we basically try and list diverse types of actions people can take, but we also like to show examples, and being able, as you said, to show the impact that people have made is very inspiring. So, so anyway, I want to thank you for the work you've pulled together, and we'll help disseminate it.
Great, thank you for your work. And how can people find your material?
Oh, yeah, so we're just basically at www.climatesteps.org.
Great.
We're a nonprofit, and it is, we were able to snag a term early. We started I started it as a blog in 2016 because two friends took me to lunch and they said, how can we fight climate change? And, you know, their actions created Climate Steps. So it's another example. The same thing happened for Citizens Climate Lobby. People asked the founder what he was going to do. So anyway, yeah, so we're trying to disseminate. We just started a collaboration with Wikipedia to help build their climate action pages, because they only really have two, and half of them are policy and they're not for individuals. And what with Wikipedia getting 450 million visitors a day, it's a very useful place. But we have to bring in solid resources, you know, and that's where stuff like your work comes in, and where the research has been done. So we're kind of helping with that. So thank you. Yeah.
Great. And thank you. And I would just encourage viewers to check out any of the impressive array of really good climate resources available online, but most importantly, to get involved where you live. Look for whatever groups are doing work in your community that you can work with on a more personal basis. I know the 350.org network has local groups around the country and around the world. We have one of the first ones here in Vermont, but many other groups as well. And also, I would encourage folks to check out the educational resources that we have posted on the Institute for Social Ecology's site, and that's social-ecology.org. And we have online classes on a variety of topics. We have many decades of accumulated writings on this and other related issues.
If I can quickly add, I'm also leading a hyper-local climate action group called Green Neighbors DC. You're probably interested to know we just started a community tool library that has massively expanded. It's becoming DC's public tool library, and we're creating our first branch, and people are so excited about this concept that will help build community resilience to disasters as well. So yeah, I totally agree. Thank you.
Well, Brian, yeah, again, thank you so much for being part of this series. Look forward to sharing this talk with many individuals and groups. For those of you who joined us, most of you, I think, who I know, I really appreciate everything you all do and have enjoyed my relationship with all of you, not just now, but in the future. So thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. And we'll stay in touch.
Yes, thank you, Tone, and look forward to staying in touch. Absolutely.
You got it. Have a good day, everybody.